of the Gore position on the Gore and Gorey position on climate change, and I'm going to say global harming is probably happening. And I'm also going to have to confess to being a green. In fact, I'm somewhat of a radical green. I'm a different kind of green. I'm a green in favor of a greenhouse. And I'm also going to make another confession, which is I don't know anything about climate change. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a climatologist. And I'm not going to, therefore, consider myself in a position to judge the debate, to decide on which side of it I am. In the absence of knowing enough about it to take a position, an informed position, I have no real choice but to choose on which side I am, the climate denialists or the climate junkies. And in the absence of being in a position to judge, I just have to go along with the climate junkies. I have to declare myself to be one of them, and therefore accept that there is global warming and climate change around. I am intrigued by the binary imperative, the view that there are only two positions you can plausibly take. You're one or the other. Of course, there are a whole range of positions you can take, as we see in this conference. The way the debate works, the way all debates work, is that if you are not with the orthodoxy on every component of the orthodoxy, every single element, if you question the minutest component of the orthodoxy, you are then by definition a skeptic or a denialist or an opponent of the orthodoxy. So I'm in the comfortable position that I don't question anything in the orthodoxy, and I therefore am one of the junkies or a believer. I am intrigued, though, about why there is disagreement. The divergent theories of science. Is this why? Is it because there's a sort of conservative or a libertarian or classical liberal science and a sort of Gore, climate change, global warming, orthodoxy science? The answer is no, there's only one science, and everybody I hear talks about the same science. I haven't heard different theories of science, at least not as far as I know. Is there divergent data? No, again, it seems to me everyone uses the same data. I see the same data here as I see in Inconvenient Truth and in all the literature on both sides. I see the same data, so the data is the same. Are there divergent interests? The answer is no. It is in the self-interest of everybody, including everybody here, to be part of the orthodoxy. It will be better for my funding, it will be better for my status, better for my influence, to join the orthodoxy, as it will be for yours. So we have a harmony of science, a harmony of data, a harmony of interests, all of which is very intriguing. How then do we get different outcomes? And the answer is we have different visions, different paradigms regarding our conceptions of the good society. This gets us appearing to have divergent theories of science, which is rather odd. And the different paradigms are these. On the one side, on the side of, let's say, the climate junkies, in which side I find myself essentially, and the climate denialists or skeptics, we have alarmism, people who are into alarmism. Whatever alarmism is about, whatever catastrophism is about, there are certain people who buy into it. They're always the same. They're always the same people who are into every current catastrophism, whether it's cooling, warming, disease, everything's getting worse, crime rates are up, whatever it is. There are certain people who just buy into whatever bad news is about, and then there are people who tend to be skeptical of whatever bad news is about. Then there's a delusional approach and a realist approach. Those people who think we can manipulate the climate. It always has changed. Everyone agrees about that. There never has been stability. But then there's some people who think that the status quo, just arbitrarily what it happens to be, is ideal and should be just kept where it is now. For the first time ever, we should just simply stop it ever changing again. And that seems to me to be somewhat delusional. I would like to, because the status quo is what produced us. We are consequences of the status quo. We are part of the biodiversity that the way the climate is now roughly produced, and therefore it is possibly in our self-interest to in fact freeze it and stop future climate change, which causes future biodiversity, which means the extinction perhaps of species like ours and new ones coming along, which the planet might prefer, but the planet doesn't apparently ever participate in the debate. It's the planet's at risk, but doesn't really express its preference in this matter. Then there's the emotional versus empirical. There's a huge amount of emotion on the one side and a huge amount of sort of hard, factual, dry, boring talk on the other. Then there's anti-technology, pro-technology. There's the dirigist, or the controlled view of society versus liberty, which I think is a big factor. And this then makes, we appear to think this gives us different conclusions about science, because we have different conclusions about the human condition. Should people be individually free or not? Then there are those in favor of stagnation, those in favor of prosperity, those for socialism and communism, those for economic freedom, those for centralization, those for decentralization, those who are ahistoric, in other words, ignoring the history of climate change, and those who are historic who think the history is important, and then those who are for looting and those who are for caring. Now, I want to just linger on that just a little bit. People on the left tend to be considered to be pro-caring. Now, I personally don't think that if I take your money for my cause, you can define me as particularly caring. The people who think you should use your own money for your own cause seem to me to be the people who are just more caring as a matter of psychology. And I'm not a psychologist, but that seems to me to be a reasonable proposition. And now my most empirical contribution to this conference. This is a graph based on an enormous amount of empirical work and data. And I'm not joking, actually. You think, oh, you all laugh at me. Well, the trouble with me is whenever I'm being serious, people laugh. So let me just tell you, there is a publication called Habits of Highly Effective Countries, and it's an enormous amount of empirical data, and that's one of the graphs in it. And what it is we engage statisticians, and we just said, what are the characteristics of winners and losers, countries that do well, countries that do badly? And in that, we don't mean, as in the economic freedom indices and so on, growth. We looked at everything. We said, in which countries do people have the longest life expectancy, the best medical care, the cleanest environments, the least child abuse, the least alcoholism, all the indicators, of which there are about 250 published indices measuring how good or bad things are in countries and in the environment. And we asked a simple empirical statistical question: what coincides most with what's good? The answer is absolutely overwhelming. With all indices except one, the wealthier countries were, the higher the GDP, the better the score on the index of everything, even egalitarian, equality, for example. So the one, by the way, where the index was the reverse correlation was sustainability, and that's really because the only sustainable situation is one in which we're all dead. Being alive is really not sustainable. Consuming is not sustainable. No, I mean, I'm serious. That is actually what the sustainability index measures. It measures the degree to which you consume things, in other words, the degree to which you live. And therefore, the wealthier countries are, by definition, less sustainable. Now, having found this quite important, this really is more empirical than this little thing suggests. It is based on actually a vast quantity of number crunching. And basically everything which anyone, including the climate junkies like me, climate change junkies, want, all the nice, lower crime rates, less child abuse, less women abuse, whatever, there's less of in richer countries. So what you want to do to have a good environment and a good society generally, and less endangered species and cleaner water and less draining of wetlands. In the old days, wetlands and rainforests used to be called, less romantically, jungles and swamps, and people weren't so keen on saving jungles and swamps as you are on saving wetlands and rainforests. So the answer is then global harming is quite serious, that if you don't get wealthy, you can't sterilize things. I was bitten by a puff adder 2 years ago, and the result of there not being serum around, which you can't have, as Baron Mitra pointed out, if you don't have lots of energy, is that I very nearly died. I went into convulsions, became semi-conscious, and anyway, here I am. I sort of made it, and then there was a lot of discourse about whether they should amputate my arm that had been bitten, and they didn't, and it's with me still. So I'm not a one-armed economist. But the thing then is that the diseases, the poverty, the consequences of poverty are in every human and environmental sense really quite devastating. And no matter what you look at, it's quite serious. And we need to understand how serious it is. These are the slides Barun Mitra showed of destitution and poverty in India. And I borrowed them from him, and I think they're worth looking at again of the kind of thing that happens. So the conclusion, it seems to me, is really quite simple. Climate change, I assume, is probable and maybe even be inevitable. And the question is what to do about it. Catastrophism of every description, alarmism, is a lifeline for the opponents of liberty and prosperity. That seems to be what decides on which side you go. Now, they were dead. There's no more serious debate about what causes poverty. Poverty is deliberate. Poverty is a consequence of policies. It can't be subject to informed debate anymore. The evidence is completely overwhelming, is that you choose policies that cause poverty, so countries that have poverty have chosen poverty. Why they do that is because there are other things they consider more important than prosperity. But it turns out those other things, which is what our research found, you also get more of with prosperity. So prosperity is the solution to everything, hence that graph of mine, including climate change. So if I accept there is going to be global warming fully within the orthodoxies camp, the best thing to do about it by a very, very big, non-contestable, non-debatable margin is to grow, to be prosperous, to be rich. Then you have all the wealth with which to deal with it. And it doesn't really matter much anymore. It actually becomes pretty close to irrelevant what happens to the climate. We are the one species that can cope with essentially anything the climate would want to throw at us. And you want to be able to put stilts and dikes in Bangladesh as you do in Holland. Land can be man-made, upwards buildings, each floor is man-made land, reclaimed land, all the wetlands and swamps of Europe. If you want to rehabilitate your wetlands, you have to basically bomb most of your cities, including this one, which were once wetlands in Washington, D.C., and so on. So what you want is wealth. It is wealth that permits you to cope with everything, and it is much easier to become wealthy. It's just what happens if you stop preventing it. So it's easier to become wealthy than it is to perpetuate the status quo of the climate, much as I would like to do it, and I'm perfectly willing to invest something in it. It produced me after all, so I'm in favor of it. I agree with the fact that you want to minimize the degree to which it changes. It's pretty okay now for us. And what I want to say is how to prosper is not debatable. It is not subject to informed debate anymore. Prosperity and poverty are choices. So with that, let me conclude with, you don't need to actually even debate climate. I'm not a climate skeptic. I go along with the majority, the orthodoxy. I'm not in a position to judge. I know too little to do so. But what I do know as an economist and a jurist is how to become prosperous, and I do know that being prosperous renders whatever climate change might happen according to current data, either way, warming or cooling, very close to irrelevant. Thank you.